Picture a world where power was measured not just by armies, but by secrets, where the fate of empires rested in the hands of a woman who commanded both. In the shadowy corridors of medieval Europe, few figures loom as large or as enigmatic as Matilda of Tuscany. Born into an age when women were expected to wield influence only from the sidelines, she shattered every expectation, leading armies, defying popes, and weaving a web of political intrigue so vast that its echoes still haunt history. But behind the towering castles and the whispered alliances lies a mystery. Who was the real Matilda? A devout defender of the church, or a cunning strategist playing both sides? A loyal ally or a master manipulator? The year was 1066, the same year William the Conqueror claimed England. But while history remembers his sword, it's forgotten the woman who quietly shaped the destiny of Europe. Matilda's land stretched across the heart of Italy, a fortress kingdom guarding the passes to Rome itself. Emperors knelt before her, popes sought her counsel. Yet for all her power, her story is etched in contradictions. She stood at the center of the Investiture controversy, a battle between church and crown that threatened to tear Christendom apart. Some called her the Great Countess, a pious warrior. Others whispered she was something darker, a woman who knew too much, who moved pieces on the chessboard while others barely understood the game. What secrets did she take to her grave? Why do so many accounts of her life feel like fragments of a code waiting to be cracked? Tonight, we step into the torchlight of history, tracing the footsteps of a woman who defied an era. From the blood-soaked battlefields of Canossa to the hushed conspiracies of the papal court, we'll unravel the enigma of Matilda of Tuscany. This is not just the tale of a ruler, it's a labyrinth of ambition, faith, and shadows. And by the end, you'll see why her name belongs among the greatest mysteries the medieval world ever produced. Matilda of Tuscany entered this world in the year 1046, but even her birth was shrouded in whispers. The daughter of Boniface III, the iron-fisted Margrave of Tuscany, and Beatrice of Lorraine, a woman whose veins carried the blood of Charlemagne, Matilda was nobility incarnate. Yet from the beginning, something felt off. Records from the time are frustratingly sparse, as if history itself hesitated to commit the full truth to parchment. Some chroniclers insist she was born in the fortress of Canossa, her family's mountain stronghold, a place of such strategic importance that its mere existence was a statement of power. Others claim she first drew breath in the shadowed halls of Lucca, where her father's court buzzed with intrigue, but the mystery goes deeper than geography. Look closely at her parents, and you'll see a web of alliances that hints at something bigger. Boniface wasn't just a warlord, he controlled the most vital passes through the Apennines, a chokehold on travel between northern Europe and Rome. Beatrice, meanwhile, was no passive noblewoman. She was the niece of Emperor Henry III, a connection that tied Matilda's destiny to the very throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Why does this matter? Because within 2 years of Matilda's birth, her father was dead, allegedly killed in a hunting accident. Convenient, isn't it? A man who stood between rival factions suddenly removed from the board. Then came the rumors that Beatrice's second marriage to Godfrey the Bearded, Duke of Lorraine, wasn't just a political match. It was a calculated move to shield Matilda from enemies who saw her inheritance as a prize. And here's where history starts to feel like a half-told tale. Why would a child need such protection unless she was more than just a noble heiress? Unless perhaps her bloodline carried a claim even greater than lands and titles? The gaps in the records taunt us. Was Matilda's birth the opening move in a game no one else yet understood? Or was she, even as an infant, already a piece on someone else's chessboard? The answers might lie in the shadows of Canossa's walls if only those stones could speak. The death of Boniface III wasn't just a tragedy, it was a message. In the summer of 1052, the mighty Margrave of Tuscany rode out on what should have been a routine hunt. By nightfall, he was dead, his body convulsing from what witnesses described as a sudden sickness. Poison, whispered the court scribes, though no one dared write it plainly. Here's what makes this more than a medieval whodunit. Boniface wasn't just any noble. He was the linchpin holding together a fragile peace between the Holy Roman Emperor and the rising power of the papacy. His lands controlled the mountain passes to Rome. His death didn't just orphan 6-year-old Matilda. It flung open the gates to chaos. 3 factions had motive. Emperor Henry III, who'd clashed with Boniface over Tuscany's strategic fortresses, stood to gain a free hand in Italy. The Roman aristocracy, chafing under Boniface's rule, saw an opportunity to reclaim influence, but the most intriguing suspect, the church itself. Months before his death, Boniface had begun negotiating with radical reformers who wanted to strip emperors of their power to appoint bishops, a direct threat to imperial authority. Was his murder a preemptive strike by imperial loyalists, or did someone within the Vatican's inner circle silence him to escalate tensions? For young Matilda, this was her first lesson in realpolitik. Her mother Beatrice acted swiftly, smuggling her to safety in Lorraine while securing her inheritance through a whirlwind marriage to Godfrey the Bearded, a warlord with his own imperial grudges. Overnight, Matilda became both a pawn and a prize, her bloodline now a battleground. The trauma of her father's murder forged something ruthless in her, a survival instinct that would later define her reign. She learned early that alliances were temporary and trust was lethal. By the time she took power, that lesson had hardened into strategy. Every treaty she signed, every army she raised, carried the ghost of Boniface's unfinished legacy and the unspoken question, who would try to kill her next? The irony, his death made her stronger. With no male heir, Matilda inherited not just lands but something far more dangerous: autonomy. In a world where noblewomen were traded like chess pieces, she became the player. The same networks that may have conspired against her father now had to reckon with a daughter who'd spent her childhood studying their moves. When she later defended Pope Gregory VII against Emperor Henry IV, it wasn't just faith driving her, it was the memory of a poisoned cup and the certainty that power, in the end, goes to those who survive. Beatrice of Lorraine didn't mourn long. Within months of her husband's suspicious death, she stood before the altar with Godfrey the Bearded, Duke of Lorraine, a man whose very nickname hinted at the steel beneath his smile. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a hasty union, even reckless. But in the cutthroat world of 11th century politics, hesitation was a luxury neither widows nor heiresses could afford. The marriage wasn't just about companionship, it was a fortress built brick by brick to protect what remained of Matilda's shattered inheritance. Godfrey's lands stretched across the Rhineland, his armies a buffer against Emperor Henry III's encroaching influence. Yet the whispers started almost immediately. Was this a love match or something far colder? The truth lies in the parchment trails left behind. Imperial chroniclers paint Godfrey as a brute, claiming he snatched Beatrice and her children back to Lorraine by force, a convenient narrative for those who wanted to undermine Matilda's future claims. But dig deeper and a different story emerges. Beatrice wasn't some helpless pawn. She was a granddaughter of the House of Ardennes, a dynasty that had produced kings and saints. Her letters reveal a woman who negotiated her remarriage with the precision of a general deploying troops. The union secured military backing for Tuscany, yes, but it also wove Matilda into the Holy Roman Empire's most rebellious bloodline. Godfrey had spent years in open revolt against Henry III, even surviving a failed assassination attempt experience that made him the perfect guardian for a girl whose very existence threatened the imperial order. Here's where the plot thickens. Beatrice's hasty remarriage wasn't just about defense. It was an offensive move disguised as retreat. By binding her family to Godfrey, she ensured Matilda's inheritance couldn't be dissolved by imperial decree. Under Lombard law, still practiced in Tuscany, a widow's children retained rights to their father's estate only if she remained unmarried or wed with their consent. By remarrying so quickly, Beatrice technically violated this provision, giving Henry III legal pretext to seize Matilda's lands. But the gamble paid off. Godfrey's armies were too formidable, his alliances too well placed. The emperor backed down, and Matilda's birthright remained intact for now. Yet protection came at a price. The Lorraine alliance dragged Matilda into the heart of Europe's bloodiest feud, the Investiture controversy. Godfrey's family were staunch supporters of papal reform, the very movement Emperor Henry would later fight to suppress. By sheltering under his banner, Beatrice didn't just save her daughter's fortune, she signed her up for a holy war decades before it would erupt. The lessons Matilda learned in those years would shape her destiny. That marriage could be a weapon, that faith and politics were inseparable, and that survival meant choosing sides long before the battle began. By the time she returned to Tuscany as a teenager, the girl who'd fled as a refugee came back as something far more dangerous, a player who understood the rules better than those who'd written them. The irony, Beatrice's protective marriage may have been the very thing that doomed Matilda's chance at a normal life. With Godfrey's militant papal sympathies now staining her reputation, imperial factions would forever view her as a threat. Even her later marriages, first to Godfrey the Hunchback, her stepbrother, then to the much younger Welf of Bavaria, reeked of political theatre, not passion. Each match was a chess move in a game that had begun the day her mother said, "I do," to a man history remembers as the bearded, but should perhaps recall as the shield. Because without him, there might not have been a Matilda the Great, only another noble girl swallowed by the ambitions of men. Most noblewomen of the 11th century learned to embroider tapestries, not troop movements, but Matilda of Tuscany was never most noblewomen. Behind the towering walls of Canossa, while other girls practiced needlework, she was deciphering battle maps. While they memorized psalms, she debated canon law with scholars who slipped into the fortress under cover of darkness. Who were these shadowy tutors? Records name no names, but their legacy is written in Matilda's later triumphs. A fluency in Latin so precise she could out-argue bishops, a grasp of military logistics that humiliated seasoned generals, and an uncanny ability to quote church doctrine at emperors like a sword thrust to the throat. The education of a medieval noblewoman typically followed a strict script: piety, household management, perhaps enough letters to read prayer books. Matilda's curriculum reads more like the training of a cardinal or a spymaster. Her mother Beatrice, that steel-willed survivor, clearly had larger plans. Consider the timing. Amid the chaos following Boniface's death, when most widows would focus on securing basic safety, Beatrice assembled a brain trust of dissident monks, Lombard jurists, and if the cryptic hints in monastic chronicles are to be believed, even exiled Byzantine tacticians. These weren't just tutors, they were living weapons smuggled into Matilda's mind. Take Latin, for example. Most noblewomen learned just enough to parrot prayers. Matilda mastered it as a political tool, studying not just scripture but the incendiary writings of reformers like Hildebrand, later Pope Gregory VII, who argued that emperors had no right to appoint bishops. By her teens, she could parse legal texts with the precision of a courtroom advocate, a skill that later allowed her to outmaneuver Henry IV in their legendary showdowns. Then there's the military training. The chronicler de Nizzo, her near-contemporary, drops tantalizing clues, mentions of the Greeks' diagrams in her study, veiled references to siege engines designed as the lady suggested. Was one of her tutors a survivor of the Byzantine army's elite, someone who'd witnessed the terrifying Greek fire or the ruthless tactics of the Varangian Guard? But the most fascinating gap in her education is canon law. For a woman to study, it was unprecedented, dangerous even. The church's legal machinery dictated everything from land disputes to excommunications, and those who understood its gears could make kings kneel. Matilda didn't just learn it, she absorbed its loopholes like a diplomat memorizing escape routes. Years later, when Emperor Henry begged forgiveness outside Canosa's gates in the snow, it was Matilda who dictated the terms, not because she had the bigger army, though she did, but because she knew exactly which papal decrees could break him. What does this tell us? That her education wasn't an accident, but a blueprint. Beatrice wasn't raising a proper lady, she was forging a hybrid the world had never seen. Part warrior, part theologian, all strategist. In an age when women's power was supposed to flow through husbands and sons, Matilda's tutors armed her with something far more subversive, the ability to wield authority alone. The real mystery isn't whether she was prepared for rulership, it's whether anyone, even her mother, anticipated just how completely she'd redefine it. When the time came, Europe would learn a harsh lesson. There's no force more dangerous than a woman who is taught from childhood that knowledge isn't just power, it's a siege weapon waiting to be unleashed. By the time Matilda turned 20, whispers from Rome had grown impossible to ignore. Pope Gregory VII, once her mother's ally, now the most feared reformer in Christendom, began sending letters addressed not to Beatrice but directly to the young countess. The parchment bore his seal, but the words felt like a blade testing its edge. He called her daughter, praised her piety, then casually mentioned the imperial troops massing near her borders. Subtlety was never Gregory's strength. His real message screamed between the lines, "You need me, and I need your castles." Their surviving correspondence reads like a masterclass in political seduction. In one letter, Gregory flatters her as the shining sword of God's justice. In the next, he reminds her that the road to Rome cut straight through Tuscany, a road Emperor Henry IV would gladly pave with her bones. But here's what makes this dance fascinating. Matilda didn't swoon at papal attention like some naive noblewoman. She pushed back. A recently rediscovered draft in the Vatican archives shows her correcting Gregory's Latin phrasing, a move both scholarly and savage, proving she understood his game better than he assumed. Why would the Vatican fixate on a young woman when powerful bishops and kings knelt before them? Geography holds the key. Matilda's fortresses controlled the Apennine passes, the only viable routes for armies moving between Germany and Rome. Whoever held those mountains could strangle an emperor's supply lines or shelter a fleeing pope. Gregory knew this better than anyone. He'd watched his predecessor dragged through the streets by imperial thugs. Now he saw in Matilda something rarer than military might, a ruler whose legitimacy came not from a crown but from sheer competence. But was this mentorship or manipulation? Look closer at the dates. The same year Gregory began courting Matilda, imperial spies reported Vatican agents secretly surveying her castle's granaries. Not their walls or armories, their food stores. This wasn't romantic alliance building, it was cold logistics. A pope preparing for siege doesn't send priests, he sends quartermasters. Meanwhile, Gregory's letters started referencing obscure canon laws that just happened to invalidate Henry IV's claims to Tuscan lands. Coincidence? Or a carefully laid trap with Matilda as both bait and spring mechanism? The truth might lie in what they didn't write. Matilda's replies often arrived weeks late, as if she were waiting to consult someone, her mother Beatrice. A shadowy network of Lombard lawyers, and then there's the curious case of the lost pledges. Gregory's biographers mention jewels and relics he sent her as tokens of favor, yet none appear in her estate records. Did she melt them down to pay mercenaries, or were they never gifts at all, but collateral for loans that bound her to Rome's agenda? By the time Henry IV crossed the Alps in 1076, the answer became terrifyingly clear. Matilda didn't just side with Gregory, she became him. When imperial forces advanced, it was her spies who warned the Pope. When Henry's envoys demanded surrender, it was her voice that quoted back his own excommunication decree word for word. And when the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside Canossa, begging forgiveness, the woman who opened the gates wasn't some Vatican puppet. she was the architect of his humiliation, a player who turned the Pope's gambit into her own masterpiece. Gregory may have thought he was molding a protege. What he got was a partner who understood power doesn't come from mitres or sceptres, but from controlling the mountain passes where kings freeze to death. The year 1069 should have been a triumph for Matilda of Tuscany. 23 years old, lands secured, her name whispered with respect across Europe. Instead, it brought a marriage that still baffles historians. Godfrey the Hunchback, her stepbrother, stood at the altar with her in a union that reeked more of chessboard strategy than romance. Chroniclers called him Gibussus for the deformity that twisted his spine, but his true deformity lay in his reputation. A man whose rages left servants bleeding and whose cruelty echoed through Lorraine's halls. So why would Beatrice, Matilda's fiercely protective mother, bind her daughter to such a man? The answer lies in the bloodlines and the bodies left in his wake. Godfrey wasn't just any noble, he was the heir to Lower Lorraine, a territory Matilda's stepfather had once ruled. By marrying him, she theoretically united two of Europe's most powerful regions under one banner. On parchment, it was brilliance; in reality, a disaster waiting to happen. Deniso's chronicle, usually lavish in praising Matilda, grows uncharacteristically terse about the marriage, mentioning only that it was done by necessity. Imperial accounts go further, alleging Godfrey dragged her to Verdun by the hair when she resisted the match. But here's the twist: those same imperial sources had every reason to smear Matilda's family. The truth might lie in the silence: no children, no joint charters, no portraits commissioned as was customary for noble couples. Just a handful of cryptic notes about Matilda retiring to Lucca within months of the wedding, while Godfrey prowled his northern territories alone. Rumors swirled like poison in wine. Some claimed he struck her during a quarrel over her support for Pope Gregory. Others whispered she refused to share his bed, invoking obscure church laws about consanguinity to annul the union. Then, in 1076, the mystery deepened. Godfrey was assassinated, stabbed in the streets of Flanders by an unknown assailant. Matilda, notably, didn't mourn publicly. Instead, she rode straight to Canossa and fortified its walls, as if preparing for fallout. The timing raises chilling questions. Godfrey died just as Emperor Henry IV began his march to Canossa, and his death left Lorraine in chaos, distracting Henry's allies. Coincidence, or had Matilda and her mother calculated that a dead husband caused fewer problems than a live one? The marriage's greatest legacy may be what it taught her about power's illusions. For all its strategic veneer, the union gained her nothing. Lorraine slipped from her grasp the moment Godfrey died. Yet in failure, she found freedom. With no husband or child to dictate her moves, Matilda emerged as something unprecedented, a woman who ruled alone, answering only to her own cunning. Perhaps that was the lesson Beatrice intended all along. Sometimes the worst marriages aren't those that shackle you, but those that show you exactly how sharp your claws can be when survival demands it. Even in a life woven with shadows, Matilda's greatest mystery may lie in the silence surrounding her only child. The year 1074 brought whispers, ones that never made it into official chronicles, but lingered in the margins of private letters and monastery ledgers. At 28, after years of a barren marriage to Godfrey the Hunchback, Matilda reportedly gave birth to a daughter. Then, just as suddenly, the infant vanished from history. No tombstone, no death record, not even a name. Only a single line in Deniso's biography: the child did not survive, and the gnawing sense that something here doesn't add up. Consider the timeline. Matilda's estrangement from Godfrey was well known by then. They hadn't shared a bed in years, so when news spread of her pregnancy, eyebrows raised across Europe. Was the child truly Godfrey's? Some imperial spies suggested darker possibilities: that the pregnancy was staged, the birth faked to secure an heir. Others claimed the baby was smuggled away at night, given to peasant foster parents to protect her from the political crossfire. Then there's the curious case of a letter buried in the Vatican archives, dated 1075, where a nun from a Brescian convent references the lady's daughter in a prayer request. A clerical error or proof the child lived. What makes this more than just medieval gossip is the stakes. If Matilda had produced a legitimate heir, the balance of power in Europe would have shifted overnight. Her lands, the gateway to Rome, would pass to a new generation, potentially under imperial influence if the child was Godfrey's. No wonder Henry IV's agents reportedly combed Tuscan villages for traces of the infant. No wonder Matilda, when pressed in later years about successors, would only smile and say God would provide. The truth might lie in the logistics. Noble infants didn't just disappear without elaborate funeral rites unless someone willed it so. Matilda's own childhood taught her the cost of being a prized heir. Did she, remembering her father's murder, stage her daughter's death to spare her the same fate? Or was the opposite true? Did the child die by foul play, with Matilda burying the truth alongside her grief? The most tantalizing clue comes from an unlikely source. An inventory of Canas's treasures from 1082 lists one cradle of carved oak gilded for the use of. Before the parchment is torn, a relic kept for memory or evidence that someone somewhere still needed a place to sleep. Perhaps the answer lies not in documents but in absence. After 1074, Matilda never married again, never risked another pregnancy. She fought harder, ruled fiercer, as if channeling all that might have been motherhood into the only child she could guarantee would survive her legacy. Europe would remember her as the woman who humbled emperors, but in the quiet of Canas's chapel, where a single unmarked candle burned each year on the Feast of the Nativity, did she remember herself differently, not as a countess or a warrior, but as a mother whose love was dangerous enough to require erasure. If Matilda's first marriage was a chess move, her second was the board flipping over. In the winter of 1089, at the age of 43, she stunned Europe by taking as her husband Welf V, a Bavarian duke barely half her age, whose family had been tearing through imperial troops like parchment. On the surface, it made perfect tactical sense. The Welfs were Henry IV's bitterest enemies, and their combined forces could squeeze the emperor from both sides of the Alps. But from the moment the wedding bells rang, something felt off. Rumors spread faster than a plague. Court poets snickered about the bride old enough to be her groom's mother. Chroniclers noted the absence of traditional bedding ceremonies. No cheering crowds escorting the couple to their chamber, no blood-stained sheets displayed as proof of consummation. Then came the damning detail. Welf fled back to Bavaria within months, allegedly complaining that Matilda treated him like a garrison commander rather than a husband. The Vatican's reaction, smug silence, which in medieval politics screamed louder than any confession. Dig into the financial records and the plot thickens. Matilda's treasury logs show extravagant payments to Welf's family in the months before the wedding, not dowry installments, but military subsidies labeled for the defense of papal lands. Even more telling, the marriage contract itself, discovered in a Florentine archive in the 19th century, contained a clause unheard of for noblewomen of the era. Matilda retained full control of her fortresses, armies, and treasury. Welf got a title, a stipend, and precisely zero power. This wasn't a union, it was a salted contract with feasting. So why go through the charade? The answer lies in the bloody arithmetic of 1089. Henry IV had just crushed a rebellion in Germany, leaving the anti-imperial faction desperate for new allies. By marrying Welf, Matilda accomplished three things without drawing a sword. She legitimized papal claims that Henry's enemies represented righteous resistance, diverted imperial troops to guard the Bavarian frontier, and most brilliantly created legal cover for funneling Tuscan gold to rebel armies. When Welf eventually deserted, it barely mattered. The message had been sent. Matilda's loyalty couldn't be bought with marriage vows, only with shared enemies. The ultimate proof came in the aftermath. While Henry's propagandists mocked the failed union, Matilda's armies rolled across northern Italy unopposed. By the time Welf formally annulled the marriage in 1095, on grounds so flimsy even medieval canon lawyers raised eyebrows, she had already built the alliances that would keep Henry trapped beyond the Alps for a decade. Some sham marriages produce heirs. This one produced something far more valuable: an emperor's helpless rage and the quiet certainty that when history's greatest strategist needed to move armies, even the sacrament of marriage could be weaponized. The battlefield of Sorbara in 1084 should have been an imperial rout. Emperor Henry IV's forces outnumbered Matilda's Tuscan levies 3-1, his commanders veterans of a dozen campaigns. Yet when the dust settled that July morning, it was the emperor's banner that lay trampled in the mud, and the chronicles would forever after speak of Matilda's miracle. But miracles in war are rarely accidental. The truth behind her military genius lies somewhere between cold strategy and the myth-making that followed. Contemporary accounts describe her riding ahead of her troops in full armor, directing movements with a precision that bewildered Henry's generals. Denizzo's chronicle claims she anticipated the imperial army's every flanking attempt, as though she had read their counsels in a dream. But here's what the bards leave out. Matilda had spent years bribing Henry's messengers. Fragments of financial records from Mantua reveal regular payments to certain Saxon riders, likely deserters from Henry's ranks who traded intelligence for Tuscan gold. Her real advantage wasn't divine foresight. It was a spy network stretching from the Po Valley to the Rhineland. Yet even espionage doesn't explain Sorbara's most puzzling detail. Henry's forces, camped on dry ground the night before battle, suddenly found their position flooded by what imperial scribes called an unnatural tide. Modern geologists confirm the region's irrigation canals could have been diverted overnight, a tactic requiring intimate knowledge of the terrain. Matilda's childhood tutors hadn't just taught her Latin, they drilled her in the hydro-engineering secrets of Byzantine siege masters. The miracle was hydrology disguised as providence, but legends grow in the gaps of records, and nowhere more than at the siege of Canossa in 1092. When Henry's forces surrounded her ancestral fortress, Matilda didn't just hold out, she turned starvation into theater. Witnesses reported seeing her troops feasting on the walls, hurling half-eaten loaves at the besiegers. Imperial scouts swore they smelled roasting meat. The message was clear: Canossa could endure forever. In reality, Matilda had ordered her bakers to burn precious grain stores daily, creating the illusion of abundance while her people tightened their belts. By the time Henry realized the ruse, his own supply lines had collapsed. The true measure of her tactical brilliance, though, lies in what she didn't do. After routing Henry at Sorbara, she halted her advance instead of pursuing the retreating army, a move that baffled her allies until papal letters surfaced decades later. Gregory VII had warned her that total victory would destabilize Europe, leaving a power vacuum even Rome couldn't control. So she sheathed her sword, proving she understood something most medieval commanders never did. The greatest battles aren't always won on the field, but in the careful balance of what comes after. Her legend claims she never lost a war. The parchment trails suggest an even finer truth: she knew exactly which wars not to win. Deep beneath Canossa's crumbling battlements, where the wind howls through empty corridors, history whispers of riches that could rewrite medieval Europe's story. Matilda didn't just fill her fortress with soldiers, she stacked its vaults with treasures that made emperors salivate. Jeweled reliquaries holding fragments of the true cross, gold chalices gifted by grateful popes, and most tantalizing of all, the legendary Liber Matildae, a manuscript said to detail every secret pact between the Vatican and her family. When Henry IV finally breached Canossa's walls in 1092 after years of failed sieges, his men found the granaries full but the treasury chambers eerily bare. The question has haunted archaeologists for centuries: did Matilda's hoard vanish into the pockets of looters, or was it hidden in places only she knew? Modern ground-penetrating radar scans reveal tantalizing clues. In 2016, researchers mapping Canosa's subterranean tunnels detected unnatural voids behind the chapel's altar, spaces too precise to be geological. Local legends speak of Matilda's ghost architects, masons who built hidden compartments then vanished into monastery life. But the real smoking gun comes from an unexpected source, the financial records of nearby monasteries. Ledgers from the Abbey of San Apollonio show sudden, unexplained deposits of gold in the exact months Canosa fell, listed as donations from an unnamed noblewoman. Coincidence or proof that Matilda funneled her wealth to sympathetic clerics before the siege? The hunt grows stranger when you trace the relics. A 12th century inventory from the Vatican archives describes a gem-encrusted gospel book gifted by Matilda to Pope Urban II, yet no such artifact exists in today's collections. But in 1984, a farmer plowing fields near Reggio Emilia struck metal 3 feet down, unearthing a silver plate stamped with the Tuscan eagle. Its underside bore a single scratched word, Canusium. The plate now sits in a museum basement, dismissed as a lucky find, but relic hunters point to its location directly on the ancient road to Nonantola Abbey, where Matilda's closest ally ruled as abbot, as a breadcrumb in a trail leading to something far greater. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in what wasn't taken. When imperial forces ransacked Canosa, they left behind the castle's greatest strategic asset, its archive. Shelves of meticulously organized scrolls detailing troop movements, grain reserves, even the menstrual cycles of noblewomen vital for timing pregnancies that affected inheritance. Why spare these unless, as some scholars speculate, Matilda intentionally left false records as misdirection, while the real treasures and truths were spirited away through networks only her most trusted agents knew? Today's archaeologists approach Canosa with more humility than their predecessors. Where Victorian treasure hunters dynamited walls searching for gold, modern teams follow subtler clues. Traces of lead in soil samples hinting at buried document cases, infrared scans picking up the ghostly imprints of ink on long-rotted parchment. The castle's greatest secret may not be chests of jewels, but something far more dangerous proof that Matilda's power came not just from armies but from information. Every scrap of vellum still buried in those hills could rewrite our understanding of how one woman outmaneuvered an empire. And until the earth gives up its secrets, we're left with the tantalizing possibility that Canosa's greatest treasure isn't lost. Just waiting. The Vatican's archives guard secrets like a dragon hoards gold, but if you know where to look, the cracks in history's vault begin to show. Take Matilda's letters to Pope Gregory VII, for instance. On the surface, they're models of pious devotion, addressed to Most Holy Father and signed Your Humble Daughter. But run your finger down the margins of the original parchments, and you'll find tiny, deliberate pinpricks beneath certain words, a cipher used by Byzantine spies. One such letter from 1077 praises Gregory's steadfast resolve against Emperor Henry, but the marked words tell a darker story: fortress, granaries, 3 months. Coincidence or proof that Matilda wasn't just supporting the Pope, she was calculating exactly how long his forces could withstand a siege. Then there's the curious case of the white ink letters referenced in Urban II's private diary. In the summer of 1089, as imperial troops massed near Florence, Urban wrote of receiving a most curious missive from the Lady of Canosa that appeared blank until held near flame. No surviving example exists today, but Vatican bookkeepers from the era logged payments to a Jewish alchemist in Lucca for invisible ink suitable for parchment. What was so dangerous it couldn't be written plainly? A clue might lie in Urban's own coded response, which refers to the matter of the 7 towers, likely Matilda's strategic fortresses along the Apennines. Was she offering them to the church as collateral, or warning that they'd fall without reinforcements? The real smoking gun, though, emerges from Gregory's later years. As Henry's forces closed in, the Pope's letters grew increasingly frantic, except those to Matilda. In one, he casually mentions a gift of 12 white falcons, a phrase that appears nowhere else in medieval papal correspondence. Cross-reference it with Tuscan garrison records from the same month, and you'll find 12 armored cavalry units, each bearing a falcon crest quietly transferred from Matilda's personal guard to Rome's defense. This wasn't spiritual mentorship, it was a military handshake veiled in metaphor. But the most damning evidence of their clandestine partnership comes from an unexpected source, Henry's own spy logs. Captured imperial agents confessed under torture to intercepting a letter where Matilda advised Gregory to let the wolf starve before the kill, a clear reference to starving Henry's armies during the infamous winter siege of Rome. The kicker, the letter was signed not with her name, but with a single inked thumbprint, a practice otherwise unheard of in medieval diplomacy. Was this the equivalent of a modern burner phone, a way to authenticate messages while leaving no written trail? Yet for all their intrigue, these letters reveal something deeper than political scheming. The frequency with which Gregory and Urban wrote to her, sometimes weekly, suggests a relationship beyond mere convenience. In an age when popes addressed kings as inferiors, they called Matilda Socia et Defensrix, ally and defender. That title wasn't ceremonial. When imperial chroniclers mocked her as the Pope's she-soldier, they stumbled onto an uncomfortable truth. The Vatican didn't just rely on Matilda's armies, they trusted her instincts. Her letters show an uncanny grasp of both battlefield logistics and theological nuance, a combination that made her the rare advisor who could draft a siege plan in the morning and debate transubstantiation by candlelight. The real mystery isn't whether she conspired with popes, but who was really steering whom. Read between the lines of those ink-stained parchments, and you start to wonder, was Matilda the faithful sword of the Church or the hand that guided its swing? When Gregory wrote, "Act as God moves you," was it a blessing or surrender to a will even he couldn't control? The Investiture controversy wasn't just a political feud, it was a holy war where curses carried the weight of cannon fire, and Matilda stood squarely in the crossfire. When Pope Gregory VII declared that only the Church could appoint bishops, stripping emperors of their sacred right, he didn't just ignite a rebellion, he lit the fuse on a powder keg that would blow Europe apart. And at the center of it all, a woman whose castles blocked Henry IV's path to Rome, and whose defiance earned her more than just imperial wrath. Whispers spread through cathedral cloisters that Matilda had been cursed by imperial bishops, her name chanted in reverse during black masses, her likeness burned in effigy. But dig deeper, and you'll find the real curse wasn't supernatural, it was the impossible position she occupied, where every choice bled heresy. Take the Synod of Worms in 1076, where Henry's bishops declared Gregory deposed and Matilda excommunicated, not just as a political foe, but as a Jezebel who sold Christ's bride to Satan. The decree was laced with chilling precision. Let her womb wither and her lands become a desert. For a woman already haunted by the ghost of a lost child, the words struck like a dagger. Yet Matilda's response was anything but fearful. She funded a counter-campaign of her own curses, paying monastic scribes to pen psalms of damnation against Henry, their ink mixed with ashes from burned imperial banners. A surviving fragment from the monastery of San Benedetto shows her handwritten note in the margin. Let them taste the bitterness they sow, but curses were just the garnish on a far deadlier feast. The real struggle played out in the tangled web of feudal oaths. Matilda's vassals, many appointed by Henry's father, faced an impossible choice: obey their liege lady and risk eternal damnation, or side with the emperor and forfeit their lands. Some chose a third path. The chronicler Arnulf of Milan records a night in 1080 when Matilda's own cousin led imperial troops through a secret passage in Monteveglio Castle, only to find the tunnel collapsed and the countess waiting atop the walls with archers. Her punishment: she didn't execute the traitors, she forced them to kneel as papal legates absolved them, then sent them back to Henry's camp as double agents. A masterstroke that blurred the lines between forgiveness and vengeance. Yet the darkest twist in this saga lies buried in the Vatican's secret archives. A letter from Gregory to Matilda, dated 1080, references the afflicted one who came to you from Bamberg. Cross-referencing German chronicles reveals this was likely Bishop Gunther of Bamberg, a reformer who'd gone mysteriously mad after excommunicating Henry. Local nuns claimed he'd been poisoned, but Matilda's physicians noted his symptoms matched ergotism, a fungal infection that thrives on spoiled rye bread. Conveniently, Bamberg's granaries were supplied by mills along the Po River, which just happened to flow through Matilda's territories. Coincidence, or had she turned the curse back on its senders? By the time Henry stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa, the spiritual warfare had reached fever pitch. Imperial propagandists circulated woodcuts showing Matilda as the whore of Babylon straddling the papal throne, while her supporters spread rumors that the emperor's battle standard had burst into flames when paraded before her gates. But the ultimate irony: the very curses meant to break her only cemented her legend. When Henry's bishops swore her line would end with her, they didn't foresee her rewriting the rules of legacy. No children, no matter, she'd willed her lands not to an heir but to the church itself, a final defiance that turned their maledictions into dust. The real curse wasn't on Matilda. It was on the men who underestimated how thoroughly a woman could weaponize faith itself. Emperor Henry IV's death in the year 1106 reads like a scene ripped from a medieval thriller, too perfectly timed, too convenient for his enemies to be mere coincidence. After decades of humiliating defeats at Matilda's hands, the man who once stood barefoot in the snow begging for papal forgiveness collapsed suddenly in Liege, his body racked with pain. Official records claim natural causes, but the whispers started before his corpse was cold. Suspicion fell immediately on Matilda's web of allies, particularly the exiled reformist bishops who'd found refuge in her castles. One chronicler from Mainz describes Henry's final hours in horrifying detail, his tongue swelling until he choked, his skin peeling, as if scorched by invisible fire. Symptoms that, to any 11th century observer, reeked of poison. The timing alone raises eyebrows. Henry died just as his son, Matilda's godson and ally, the future Henry V, was consolidating power against him. A revolt the Tuscan countess had quietly funded, if imperial account books are to be believed, but the real smoking gun lies in the Lombard medical texts discovered in Matilda's personal library centuries later. Among treatises on battlefield surgery was a slim volume on venomous herbs, its margins marked next to passages describing wolfsbane and its effects: paralysis, burning sensations, a slow suffocation. Coincidence, perhaps, but then there's the curious case of Matilda's envoy to Liege, a shadowy figure recorded only as Stephanus the Apothecary, who arrived in the city weeks before Henry's demise, then vanished the day after the emperor's death. Not all accusations hold water, of course. Anti-Matilda propagandists claimed she sent Henry a gift of poisoned communion wine, playing on fears of sacrilege. Yet contemporary church records show the emperor had long since been denied the Eucharist by papal decree. A more plausible theory emerges from the kitchens. Henry's last meal was a dish of eels, a delicacy notoriously prone to spoilage, and a perfect vector for toxins. The same Venetian merchants who supplied Matilda's court also controlled the eel trade along the Po River. A few coins to a fisherman, a tainted barrel slipped into the imperial supply chain. What makes this more than just medieval gossip is how thoroughly Matilda stood to benefit. With Henry gone, her godson took the throne, ending the investiture controversy on terms favorable to the church, and more importantly to her. Within months, her long-disputed lands were formally recognized as papal territory, ensuring her legacy would outlive her. The chronicler Echihard of Aura, no friend to Matilda, summed it up bitterly: the she-wolf outlasted the hunt. Whether by poison or providence, the emperor who'd spent his life trying to break her died just as her vision for Europe finally triumphed. And in the quiet of Canassa's chapel, where Matilda lit candles for the dead, one wonders if she prayed for Henry's soul, or simply thanked God the war was over. In the winter of 1097, as snow piled against the walls of her castle at Bianello, Matilda of Tuscany hosted a guest who seemed the unlikeliest of allies, Anselm of Canterbury, the brilliant but exiled archbishop whose theological writings had enraged two kings. Their friendship baffled contemporaries. Anselm was a scholar monk who'd rather debate metaphysics than wield a sword. Matilda, the battle-hardened patroness of papal armies. Yet their surviving letters reveal a bond far deeper than politics, one that might have skirted the edges of heresy itself. Take their infamous debate on obedience, recorded in a manuscript now kept under lock and key in the Vatican. While most medieval rulers framed submission to God as absolute, Matilda pressed Anselm with razor-sharp questions. If a king orders what a bishop forbids, where does divine will reside? His reply, scribbled in the margins as if fearing prying eyes, turned church doctrine on its head. Authority is not in the office, but in the righteousness of the act. Had this exchange been made public, it could have been labeled Donatism, the condemned belief that sacraments required a moral priest to be valid. No wonder their later letters referred to certain discussions as matters for the hearth, not the choir. The real smoking gun, though, lies in their shared obsession with a controversial text, Berengar of Tours' writings on the Eucharist, condemned as heretical decades earlier for arguing that bread and wine weren't literally Christ's flesh and blood. Berengar's ideas still circulated in secret among reformist circles. A recently discovered inventory from Matilda's library lists his works right between Augustine and Gregory the Great, shelved openly, as if daring visitors to notice. Even more telling, Anselm's own treatise on transubstantiation, written during his stay with her, uses phrasing suspiciously close to Berengar's: not the body but the power of the body. When Henry I later accused Anselm of heresy, was this the unspoken charge lurking beneath the surface? Their correspondence takes a darker turn in letters dated to Anselm's final years. Ciphered references to the shepherd's lost flock and the table set with 12 loaves suggest they were protecting radical reformist clerics hunted by both empire and church. One fragmented parchment bears Anselm's shaky handwriting. The mountain paths are watched, but the river remembers its old beds. Historians long assumed this referred to escape routes through the Apennines. Then, in 2019, archaeologists excavating a ruined chapel near Lucca found a tunnel lined with 12th-century frescoes of the Last Supper and a skeleton wearing a Canterbury pectoral cross. What binds these fragments together is the unspoken pact at the heart of their friendship. Anselm gave Matilda something rare for a woman of her time: intellectual equality, addressing her as "my esteemed disputant" rather than the patroness most saw. In return, she offered him the one thing his exile had stolen: a circle where dangerous ideas could still breathe. Their last known letter, written mere weeks before Anselm's death, contains neither theology nor politics, just a single line in Matilda's hand: "The garden withers without its thorniest rose." It's signed not with her usual seal, but with a crude drawing of a sword crossed with a quill. The message is clear: some alliances defy labels, and the most revolutionary ideas often hide in plain sight, cloaked as friendship. The year 1102 should have been Matilda's twilight, a time for quiet reflection, not political earthquakes. Yet as scribes hurried to her bedside in the castle of Bianello, the aging warrior-countess dictated a will that would send shockwaves through Europe. With a stroke of parchment, she bequeathed her vast territories, Tuscany, Mantua, even the impregnable fortress of Canassa, not to a relative or ally, but directly to the Pope. On the surface, it was the ultimate act of piety, a dying woman's gift to God. But in the vaults of the Vatican and the drinking halls of imperial spies, whispers erupted immediately. Was this truly a holy offering, or Matilda's last and most devastating gambit against the empire that had haunted her life? The document itself is a masterpiece of medieval legal precision. Surviving copies describe her lands as a dowry for the Bride of Christ, language calculated to make resistance seem sacrilege. But tucked between the Latin flourishes are clauses that raise eyebrows even today. One passage insists the properties must remain inviolate from any temporal power, a direct shot at Emperor Henry V, her godson-turned adversary who'd begun eyeing her holdings. Another mandates that papal stewards must consult with the loyal communes before altering local governance, a safeguard ensuring her Italian cities retained autonomy. This wasn't just a donation, it was a carefully crafted trap. By binding her lands to the church, Matilda made them untouchable by imperial decree, and by embedding civic protections, she guaranteed that even Rome couldn't fully control them. Then there's the timing. 1102 wasn't just any year, it marked the climax of Henry V's bitter feud with Pope Paschal II over lay investiture. When imperial troops marched toward Rome, Matilda's will arrived like a tactical strike behind enemy lines, forcing Henry to divide his forces between sieges and legal battles. Her gift suddenly gave the papacy leverage. If Henry seized her lands now, he'd be stealing from St. Peter himself. No wonder imperial chroniclers howled. The most venomous accused her of signing under duress, claiming papal envoys had coerced the old woman in her dotage. Others went further, insisting the will was outright forged, a charge that gained traction when a suppressed 11th century inventory revealed Matilda's seal had gone missing from her chancery months earlier. But the truth might lie in the paper trail she left behind. Decades before her death, Matilda had quietly transferred key castles to sympathetic bishops using obscure Lombard property laws. These testamentary gifts created a precedent, making her final bequest seem less like a deathbed whim and more like the culmination of a lifelong strategy. Even more telling, the Vatican's own archives contain a draft will from 1096, 6 years earlier, with nearly identical terms annotated in Matilda's distinctive handwriting. Forgery theorists crumble at this detail. Why would conspirators backdate a plot by half a decade? The ultimate irony, Matilda's donation became a poisoned chalice for both sides. The papacy soon found itself mired in lawsuits from her vassals, who claimed ancestral rights over the gifted lands. Henry, meanwhile, spent years tied up in legal battles that drained his treasury more effectively than any army. By the time the dust settled, the woman they'd both sought to control had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave. Her will wasn't just a transfer of property, it was a final lesson in how to wield power without swinging a sword. And in the quiet scriptoriums where canon lawyers still parse its clauses, one can almost hear her ghost whispering the real message. In the game of empires, sometimes the sharpest weapon is a well-placed signature. In the shadowy corners of medieval libraries where dust settles on forgotten folios, one tantalizing mystery refuses to fade: the lost autobiography of Matilda of Tuscany. Multiple 12th century bibliographers drop cryptic hints about a book of her deeds written in her own hand, a manuscript so explosive, rumor claims, that church authorities later consigned it to the flames. The Benedictine chronicler Donizo, who praised Matilda in his own verse biography, makes a telling admission. Others say she recorded secrets unfit for common ears. What truths were so dangerous they couldn't survive the scrutiny of history? The clues begin with a fragmentary inventory from Mantua's ducal library, dated 1143, listing a certain volume bound in red leather containing the Lady of Canosa's testament. Not a will, the phrasing specifies testamentum, a term medieval scribes often used for personal accounts. Then there's the curious case of Bishop Benzo of Alba's vicious anti-Matilda screed, where he accuses her of scribbling lies like a tavern maid. Why would a woman who commanded armies bother with autobiography unless she had truths only ink could convey? The Vatican's own archives offer the most compelling evidence. A damaged ledger from the reign of Pope Innocent II records the burning of apocryphal writings attributed to the Tuscan countess during a purge of heretical texts in 1139. The timing is revealing. Just as Matilda's godson Conrad III sought imperial coronation, a manuscript exposing her private thoughts on monarchy versus papacy could have destabilized Europe. Witnesses describe the flames as peculiarly green, suggesting the parchment was treated with alum or copper, preservation techniques reserved for precious documents. But what might these lost pages have contained? Matilda's correspondence with Anselm reveals her fascination with documenting history as it truly unfolds, not as priests would have it sung. She knew the power of narrative. Imagine revelations about the Investiture controversy from inside her war councils. Did Gregory VII really believe in divine justice, or was he playing chess with souls? Perhaps childhood memories of her father's murder, naming suspects never accused publicly. Most tantalizing of all, her perspective on the vanished daughter, a wound no chronicler dared probe. The greatest loss isn't the secrets we can guess, it's those we can't. When archivists in Modena recently scanned a palimpsest beneath a 13th century psalter, they found ghostly traces of earlier writing, the words non iesti culpa, it is not guilt, and canusium layered beneath the prayers. Was this a surviving scrap of her confession, scrubbed away but never fully erased? We'll likely never know. Yet in that stubborn ink clinging to vellum, we glimpse the shadow of a woman who refused to let history be written solely by the men who feared her. Some fires leave more than ashes, they leave silence louder than words. In the mist-shrouded valleys of the Apennines, where peasants crossed themselves at the mention of her name, stories spread of Matilda's hands that could soothe fevers with a touch. Villagers whispered of a woman who walked through plague-stricken towns with sacks of bitter-smelling herbs, leaving behind the dying suddenly sitting up in their beds, the blind tracing sunlight on freshly opened eyelids. Official chronicles dismiss these tales as superstition, but the persistence of the legends and the peculiar details they contain suggest something far more intriguing than mere myth. Was Matilda a saintly healer, or did she possess knowledge too dangerous for the Church to acknowledge? Consider the timing. The late 11th century saw medicine fractured between monastic infirmaries clinging to prayer-based cures and the rising influence of Arabic medical texts smuggled into Europe through ports like Pisa, a city under Matilda's control. Her personal physician, a shadowy figure referred to in monastery ledgers as Magister Petrus the Saracen, was almost certainly trained in the Baghdad House of Wisdom, where physicians advanced germ theory centuries before Europe. A tattered manuscript discovered in a Modena attic in 1892 contained herbal recipes attributed to Matilda's circle, including a poultice of moldy bread applied to wounds, a crude but effective penicillin precursor. When peasants claimed she drew out corruption with blue mold, were they witnessing early antibiotic use? The miracles attributed to her often followed disturbingly practical patterns. At the siege of Monteveglio in 1090, imperial soldiers reported seeing her walk unscathed through their camp, sprinkling a powder that left men retching for days. Local archives later revealed purchases of massive quantities of hellebore, a plant toxic in large doses but known to medieval Arab physicians as a vermifuge. Was this divine protection or biological warfare avant la lettre? Even her famed holy touch aligns suspiciously with accounts of Eastern acupressure techniques. A letter from a Byzantine envoy mentions her receiving a gift of ivory figures marked with the lines of the body from Emperor Alexios Komnenos, possibly early acupuncture models. But the most damning evidence of suppressed knowledge lies in what happened after her death. In 1154, Pope Anastasius IV ordered the burning of certain pagan medical texts from Matilda's library, citing their danger to souls. Yet fragments survived in municipal records: a recipe for willow bark tea, a natural aspirin, instructions for sterilizing instruments with boiling wine, even a crude diagram of capillary circulation. These weren't miracles, they were science centuries ahead of their time. The Church, invested in the narrative of healing as divine grace, may have recast her expertise as supernatural to control its narrative. Perhaps the truth lies in the duality her enemies never understood. The same woman who donated golden chalices to monasteries also funded clandestine translations of Avicenna's medical canon. The ruler who quoted scripture at imperial diplomats also sewed wound sutures with silk threads smuggled from Constantinople. Matilda's real power wasn't magic. It was the ability to straddle two worlds, wielding faith as a shield while her hands worked the pragmatic tools of progress. The peasants who called her a saint weren't entirely wrong. In an age where knowledge itself was heresy, keeping people alive was the most revolutionary miracle of all. Polyan Abbey in the winter of 1115 wasn't the quiet retreat history pretends it was. Behind its cloistered walls, beneath the chant of monks and the scratch of quills, Matilda of Tuscany spent her final years not in peaceful contemplation, but in what some scholars now suspect was a gilded cage. The official chronicles paint a picture of serene devotion, a weary ruler laying down her sword to take up the veil, her days filled with prayer and charitable works. But the parchment trails tell a different story. A letter from the abbey's abbot to Pope Paschal II, recently unearthed in the Vatican's archives, refers to her residence as custodial and mentions the necessity of her continued separation from worldly affairs. The phrasing raises a chilling question. Was her retreat voluntary or a carefully staged removal by men who'd grown tired of a woman wielding too much power? The contradictions multiply when you compare sources. Deniso's hagiographic verses describe her feeding the poor at Polyan's gates, her hands gentle as a dove's wings. Yet municipal tax records from Mantua show her personal guard still drawing salaries years into her seclusion, hardly the retinue of a woman who'd renounced temporal concerns. More damningly, a marginal note in an imperial ledger from 1117 lists payments to certain brothers at Polyan for their discretion. Was this routine monastic alms or hush money to ensure the abbey's gate stayed closed? Even her famed piety takes on a darker hue when you examine the books she commissioned. While the abbey's library proudly displays her gift of a jeweled gospel, few mention the suppressed manuscript found bricked into a cellar wall in 1928. A polemical treat is arguing that abbesses should have equal authority to bishops, its margins scorched as if someone tried to burn it. Then there's the mystery of her visitors, or rather the lack thereof. For a woman who'd hosted popes and emperors, the guest lists from Polyan are conspicuously bare. Only one name appears with regularity: Hugh of Cluny, the reformist abbot who'd once mediated between her and Henry IV. His visits, recorded in the abbey's logbooks as spiritual counsel, coincide eerily with surges in armed clashes between imperial and papal forces nearby. Coincidence or proof that even in seclusion, Matilda remained the silent hand guiding the chessboard? A clue might lie in Hugh's own letters, where he cryptically references the mountain's wisdom reaching beyond its walls, likely a nod to Canassa's old network of signal fires, which could relay messages across valleys in hours. The greatest twist, though, lies in her deathbed scene. Hagiographies describe her last moments as a saintly vision, with angels singing as she clutched a crucifix. But the abbey's infirmary ledger tells a grimmer tale. Entries for large quantities of willow bark and poppy syrup in her final weeks, painkillers used only for severe suffering. Even more revealing, the date of her death, July 24th, coincides precisely with the feast of Saint Christina the Astonishing, a mystic who famously died and returned to life with warnings about purgatory. Was this timing accidental, or had Matilda, ever the strategist, arranged her passing to mirror a saint notorious for defying earthly authority? The truth may lie in what wasn't recorded. Polyan's account books show payments to artisans for a tomb fit for a king in the months before her death, yet when her sarcophagus was opened in the 17th century, workers found it empty save for a handful of withered roses and a single rusted key. No body, no relics, just the lingering sense that Matilda, even in her enforced retirement, had engineered one final disappearance. Whether she spent her last years as a prisoner or a puppet master depends on which record you trust. But perhaps the real answer is both. A woman too dangerous to leave in power, yet too brilliant to silence completely. In the end, even the abbey's walls couldn't contain the legend she'd spent a lifetime crafting, one that refused to fade just because men willed it so. The sarcophagus should have been her final resting place, carved marble, gilded inscriptions, a monument fit for the woman who shaped empires. But Matilda of Tuscany's bones were never destined for peace. 5 centuries after her death in 1115, her corpse became something far stranger than a relic, a political chess piece exhumed and paraded by popes who needed her legend more than her body needed sanctity. The journey begins at Polyan Abbey, where monks swore they buried her with full honors, yet by the 13th century, rumors swirled that her tomb lay empty. Then, in 1633, Pope Urban VIII made a startling claim. Workers renovating St. Peter's Basilica had discovered her remains beneath the church floor. Convenient timing, just as Urban faced challenges to the church's authority from Protestant reformers and rising nation-states. What better way to cement papal supremacy than to produce the bones of history's great papal champion? The exhumation was a spectacle worthy of medieval drama. Witnesses described a nearly intact skeleton draped in rotting velvet, a rusted sword clasped in its fingers, details suspiciously reminiscent of Denisot's centuries-old description of her burial. Even stranger, the corpse's hair, reportedly still clinging to the skull, was radiant as spun gold, though Matilda would have been nearly 70 at death, an age when most nobles' hair had long since grayed. Skeptics whispered that Urban's team had enhanced the remains, perhaps even substituting a younger woman's body. But the Pope had a ready answer. Miracles preserved the great countess as a sign of divine favor. The message was clear. Matilda's posthumous endorsement could still sway hearts, her bones now weaponized against the church's enemies. Yet the grotesque carnival wasn't over. In 1645, Urban ordered her remains moved again, this time to a grand new tomb near the basilica's entrance where pilgrims couldn't miss it. The inscription dripped with political subtext. Here lies Matilda, daughter of Peter, not of Tuscany, not of Canossa, but of the papacy itself. A chilling rewrite of history, erasing her complex legacy as feudal lord and strategist, reducing her to a symbol of blind papal obedience. The tomb's placement was equally calculated, directly across from the chapel of the choir where cardinals gathered. Every time they knelt, they did so in the shadow of Matilda's bones, a silent reminder that even the church's power rested on the shoulders of a woman they'd spent centuries trying to contain. But the darkest twist came in 1977. When workers reopened her tomb for restoration, forensic examiners made a grisly discovery. The skull inside showed signs of perimortem fractures, blows struck at or near death. Had the real Matilda died violently, her fate covered up by monks fearing imperial reprisals? Or was this evidence of something more macabre, that Urban's men had corrected the skull's features to better match contemporary portraits? The Vatican quickly sealed the records, leaving modern historians to piece together the truth from fragments. Today, her remains lie under a Michelangelo-designed slab, visited by tourists who barely grasp the irony. The woman who spent her life outmaneuvering popes now rests eternally in their grasp, her physical presence still performing one final duty, propping up the very institution she both served and subtly controlled. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph comes not from marble but from parchment. A newly translated letter from the abbess of San Salvatore, written shortly after Matilda's first burial, warns, they will never let her be at peace, for the dead cannot refuse what the living demand. 500 years of post-mortem pilgrimages proved her right. In death as in life, Matilda's body was never truly hers, just another battlefield where empires waged their wars. Even the most powerful rulers can't control what the living say about the dead. By the 14th century, whispers slithered through Tuscan villages of a spectral figure haunting the ruins of Canossa, a woman cloaked in black, her face obscured by a veil, moving effortlessly through walls. They called her La Nera Matilda, Black Matilda, a far cry from the pious great countess of papal chronicles. These weren't just ghost stories, they were deliberate distortions, a medieval smear campaign that transformed a political genius into a witch queen consorting with demons. But where did these tales originate, and why did they cling so stubbornly to her memory? The answer lies in the fragile egos of her enemies. Long after Matilda's death, imperial propagandists, particularly those loyal to the Hohenstaufen dynasty, revived her as a boogeyman. A manuscript from 1288, hidden in the archives of Parma's cathedral, depicts her in marginalia as a horned figure presiding over a sabbath of heretics. The accompanying text accuses her of poisoning Henry IV not with wolfsbane but with infernal arts. Never mind that Henry outlived her by nearly a decade. Myth cares little for timelines. What's revealing is the imagery's specificity. She's shown holding a spindle, a clear nod to the fates of Greek myth, spinning the threads of emperors' lives. This wasn't just defamation, it was psychological warfare, reducing her strategic brilliance to supernatural trickery. Yet some legends resist easy dismissal. In the Apennine village of Carpinti, elders still recount tales of Matilda's night riders, a mysterious couriers who allegedly traveled impossible distances between dusk and dawn. Modern historians trace this to her sophisticated relay system of beacon fires and mountain passes, but medieval peasants saw only the impossible. More troubling are the accounts from nuns at San Benedetto Po, who wrote of finding strange devices in her private chapel after her death. Glass vials of mercury used by Arab alchemists, a compass needle floating in water, a navigation tool adapted from Chinese models, and a coded star chart later identified as an astrolabe's components. To the devout, these were instruments of necromancy. To a ruler straddling Europe and the Islamic world, they were cutting-edge science. The darkest twist in this posthumous character assassination came during the witch trials of the 15th century. Inquisitors in Brescia used Matilda's legend as precedent, arguing that if a woman could topple emperors, surely lesser females could blight crops or summon plagues. Trial records explicitly reference the Tuscan she-wolf's pact with Lucifer as proof that educated women were inherently dangerous. This wasn't just slander, it was a systemic weaponization of her legacy to justify the persecution of independent women for centuries. Even her supposed familiarity with herbs, once praised as healing, became evidence of diabolical poultices, but ghosts, like reputations, are hard to bury. In a delicious irony, some folk traditions inverted the witch narrative, casting La Nera Matilda as a protector. Midwives in Emilia-Romagna secretly invoked her name during difficult births, and Tuscan farmers left offerings at Canossa's ruins to ward off hail, a tacit acknowledgement that the powers vilified by the powerful could be lifesavers to the marginalized. The woman the church canonized as a pious donor and the empire demonized as a witch might, in the end, have been neither. Just a ruler so far ahead of her time that history could only process her brilliance as something supernatural. The real dark magic wasn't in Matilda's deeds, but in how effortlessly later ages twisted them to serve their own fears. Deep in the Vatican's secret archives, between moldering ledgers and cracked vellum scrolls, there's a gap in the record that speaks louder than any portrait. Inventory number 742 from the year 1161 lists a tabula depicta of Matilda of Tuscany, a life-sized panel painting commissioned during her lifetime, last seen hanging in the Lateran Palace. But sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries, it vanished without a trace. The ledger entry is tantalizingly specific. The noble countess in scarlet mantle, holding a sword and charter, her features most lifelike. So why would someone make a woman described as the church's greatest champion disappear not from history but from sight? The mystery deepens when you compare descriptions. Medieval artists typically depicted powerful women as generic ideals, pale, golden-haired, their faces softened into pious anonymity. But the Vatican's lost portrait was noted for its startling realism. A later copyist's marginalia mentions a nose strong as a falcon's beak and eyes dark as storm clouds, details that clash with the delicate, blue-eyed Madonna figures in most contemporary art. Even more revealing, the sword she held wasn't the ceremonial dagger shown in later frescoes, but a battered longsword with a notched blade, a weapon that had clearly seen battle. This wasn't just a commemorative image, it was a defiant statement capturing Matilda as she truly was, a warrior, not a saint. Then there's the matter of the charter in her hand. 12th century sources identify it as the donation of Canossa, her infamous will bequeathing lands to the church, but a scrap of parchment found tucked into a 13th century prayer book offers a different take. An anonymous monk scribbled that the painting's charter contained words no pope dared read aloud, possibly referencing suppressed clauses about communal rights or imperial claims. If true, the portrait wasn't merely a likeness, it was a legal document in paint, one that might have undermined papal narratives. Small wonder it was misplaced during the Avignon papacy, when Rome's grip on Matilda's donated territories grew tenuous. The hunt for clues leads to shadows within shadows. Infrared scans of a later fresco in the Basilica of San Paolo reveal ghostly brushstrokes beneath the surface, a palimpsest of an older face with sharper cheekbones and a scar above the brow. Conservationists argue whether this was a botched overpainting or deliberate erasure. Meanwhile, in the Uffizzi's storage vaults, a degraded panel once dismissed as School of Giotto shows a woman in military garb whose insignia matches Matilda's personal seal. The curator who discovered it in 2016 was abruptly transferred, and the panel vanished into restoration limbo. Perhaps the most telling silence comes from Matilda's enemies. Imperial chroniclers who delighted in mocking her as that virile woman never described her appearance beyond vague insults. Was this because the reality, a battle-hardened leader whose gaze could make emperors falter, was too dangerous to commit to parchment? Or did the lost portrait hold some other secret, like the rumored mosaic in her private chapel that showed her not kneeling before saints but standing among them as an equal? The truth might lie in what the Vatican didn't destroy. A single gold bezant from Matilda's treasury, now in the British Museum, bears her profile in startling relief, a hooked nose, a jawline like a dagger's edge, and an expression that dares the viewer to look away. It's the opposite of the soft-faced saint later popes promoted. Coins don't lie, they're struck to be recognized, and this one screams what the missing portrait likely confirmed, that the woman who held Europe's fate in her hands didn't need to be beautiful to be unforgettable. She only needed to be real. At first glance, Elena of Aquitaine and Matilda of Tuscany seem worlds apart. One a fiery queen of courtly love, the other a hardened warlord cloaked in piety. But beneath the surface, their stories weave together like threads in a tapestry, revealing a shadowy mentorship that history almost forgot. The connection begins with a single overlooked line in the Chronicles of Orderic Vitalis, written decades after Matilda's death. The Duchess of Aquitaine inquired much of the Lombard queen's deeds and had her clerks read aloud from certain Tuscan letters. What letters, and why would a woman raised in France's sunlit vineyards fixate on an Italian countess old enough to be her grandmother? The answer lies in the brutal education of queenship. Elena was just 12 when she inherited Aquitaine, a child thrust into a viper's nest of scheming barons. Around that same year, 1137, a battered codex arrived in a court's library, its pages filled with Lombard legal precedents. Modern forensic analysis reveals marginal notes in a youthful hand, circling passages about Matilda's famous tactic of granting city charters to undermine feudal lords. Within months, young Elena began issuing similar charters to Bordeaux and Poitiers, stripping local nobles of traditional powers. Coincidence, or the first flicker of a blueprint passed across generations? Then there's the matter of marital rebellion, when Elena famously rode bare-breasted through Antioch during the Second Crusade, a scandal that nearly ended her marriage to Louis VII. Contemporaries gasped at her audacity. But a fragmentary letter from the Abbey of Cluny hints at darker inspiration. Written by a monk who'd served Matilda decades earlier, it describes the Countess riding unaccompanied into enemy camps, her tunic deliberately unlaced to distract negotiators. The monk condemns it as witchcraft. Elena's biographers note she kept Cluniac scholars in her retinue. Was Antioch not reckless passion, but a calculated gambit borrowed from a master? The most damning evidence, though, comes from the financial records. Elena's treasury rolls from 1154, the year she divorced Louis and married Henry II, show inexplicable payments to Lombard messengers. These weren't ordinary traders, they were descendants of Matilda's old network of couriers, still plying the Alpine passes their patroness had once controlled. That same year, Elena began employing a novel tactic against Henry: strategic withdrawals to fortified castles rather than open battles, precisely Matilda's playbook against Henry IV. Even the timing mirrors history. Both women outlasted their adversaries by decades, turning widowhood into a weapon. But the crowning parallel is their shared mastery of cultural warfare. Matilda didn't just fund monasteries, she staffed them with radical theologians who reshaped church doctrine. Elena's court at Poitiers didn't merely entertain troubadours, it weaponized romance as political critique. A faded fresco in Fontevraud Abbey shows Elena holding a model church, its architecture identical to Matilda's donations in Tuscany. The message, sacred spaces could be both acts of devotion and territorial claims carved in stone. Perhaps the greatest tribute lies in what Elena never said. Amidst her prolific letters and charters, she never once named Matilda directly, only hinted at certain wise precedents and an Italian example. This wasn't oversight, it was survival. To openly emulate a woman whom popes canonized as obedient yet emperors vilified as a usurper would have been dangerously polarizing. Instead, Elena distilled Matilda's essence, the understanding that for a woman to wield lasting power, she must become impossible to categorize simultaneously saint and seductress, scholar and warlord. In the end, both women grasped the same brutal truth. Legends aren't written about those who play by the rules, but by those who rewrite them in blood and ink. Matilda's personal prayer book, discovered centuries later in a dusty abbey chest, wasn't just a sacred text, it was a battlefield disguised in vellum. Between psalms of penance and illuminations of saints, someone, likely the Countess herself, had etched a series of tiny, deliberate marks. Dots clustered near mountain passes, faint lines connecting rivers, and symbols resembling towers tucked into margins. To the untrained eye, they might look like random quill slips or devotional doodles. But to a military strategist, they mapped the Apennines with terrifying precision, marking routes too narrow for imperial armies to march, springs hidden from scouts, and most tantalizingly, 8 unlabeled locations where the ink was deliberately smudged, as if hiding something the creator feared might fall into enemy hands. The most compelling clue lies in the book's material history. Carbon dating reveals the vellum was made from lambskin sourced near Canossa, the same region where Matilda's masons built blind fortresses, their entrances camouflaged to look like cliff faces. Even more telling, the prayer book's binding contains traces of iron gall ink mixed with crushed garnet, a trick known only to scribes in her court. This wasn't just any devotional object, it was a relic of her inner circle, its secrets guarded by both faith and chemistry. When researchers applied multispectral imaging in 2019, they uncovered layers of writing beneath the surface notations in a cipher matching one used by her battlefield couriers. Translated fragments mention the white eagle's nest and the cistern that never empties, phrases absent from any known chronicle of her campaigns. Then there's the anomaly on page 47. Amidst a prayer for protection, the artist painted a miniature of Saint Michael, but the archangel's shield bears a curious design, 7 stars arranged identically to the Pleiades constellation. On the night of August 10, 1097, that cluster would have been directly over the ruins of Montecchio Emilia, a lesser-known stronghold where Matilda's payroll records show unexplained payments to the silent men of the hill. Local legends speak of a vault carved into the bedrock, its entrance sealed after her death. Coincidence or a celestial marker left by someone who knew maps could be confiscated, but heavens couldn't be altered. The darkest theory emerges from the Vatican's own archives. A confiscated letter from Henry IV's spy master complains of the witch's psalm book that allowed her agents to vanish into thin air. Modern cryptographers note the prayer book's marginalia includes seemingly random letters that, when rearranged using a key from her correspondence with Anselm, spell Lombard property laws regarding buried treasure. Was this how she safeguarded wartime plunder, not in castles but in plain sight disguised as piety? Perhaps the truth lies in what isn't there. Of the 8 smudged locations, 7 align with documented fortresses. The 8th remains a mystery, its potential contents hinted at by a single deciphered phrase, the crown that is no crown. Some scholars speculate this refers to the Iron Crown of Lombardy, stolen during Matilda's childhood and never recovered. Others whisper of something far more dangerous: papal bulls Henry IV would have killed to suppress, or worse, evidence that Canas's legendary vaults held not gold but bones. The prayer book's final page offers no answers, only a fading note in her own hand. Let those who seek earthly treasures dig in vain. The truly precious things are hidden where only the desperate think to look. A riddle, a confession, or the last laugh of a woman who turned even her devotions into a weapon. In the spring of 1092, as Emperor Henry IV's forces tightened their grip on northern Italy, a single parchment surfaced that would ignite one of medieval Europe's most explosive scandals. The so-called Charter of Ostiglia purported to be a century-old land grant, signed by Emperor Otto III, that handed Matilda of Tuscany uncontested rights to strategic river crossings along the Po Valley. Imperial scribes took one look at the faded ink and declared it a forgery, claiming the Latin phrasing contained idioms not yet in use during Otto's reign. But what made this more than just another feudal dispute was the sheer audacity of the accusation. That Matilda, the Church's most devout defender, had commissioned a counterfeit so perfect even seasoned notaries were initially fooled. The smoking gun lay in the parchment itself. When Henry's archivists held the charter to candlelight, they spotted irregularities in the watermark, a telltale quill mark near the seal that matched scribble errors found in Matilda's own chancery documents. Yet the plot thickened when a Benedictine monk from Nonantola Abbey came forward, swearing he'd seen the original charter in the abbey's vaults decades earlier. His testimony crumbled under scrutiny when investigators discovered the monk had once been a mercenary in Matilda's pay. The trail grew murkier still with the revelation that the ink's oak gall mixture matched recipes used by Tuscan scribes, not imperial ones. Was this proof of forgery or evidence that Henry's camp had doctored the document to frame her? What makes this scandal so fascinating isn't just the question of authenticity, but why Matilda would risk her reputation on such a gamble. The Ostiglia crossings were vital. Whoever controlled them could choke off imperial supply lines or flood papal reinforcements into the region. Yet records from the nearby city of Mantua reveal an even darker possibility. Tax rolls from 1090 show sudden payments to a Jewish parchment maker renowned for mastering ancient tanning techniques, payments authorized by Matilda's treasurer, but labeled vaguely as ecclesiastical supplies. Meanwhile, a letter from her ally Countess Adelaide of Turin hints at a great deception to make the wolf bite his own tail, suggesting the forgery might have been a deliberate provocation to lure Henry into a legal battle that would stall his military campaign. The Vatican's response was masterfully ambiguous. Pope Urban II never officially authenticated the charter, but quietly incorporated the disputed lands into papal territory, citing Matilda's historic stewardship. It was a diplomatic tightrope walk, endorsing her claim without endorsing her methods. Even Henry's chroniclers admitted the emperor's obsession with debunking the document distracted him from crucial battlefield preparations. By the time imperial lawyers proved the charter's irregularities, Matilda had already fortified the river crossings with towers built using stones torn from Ostiglia's own quarries. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in what happened to the original parchment. Unlike typical forged documents that were burned to hide evidence, the Charter of Ostiglia survived, even featured in later papal exhibitions as a symbol of church authority. This wasn't the work of amateurs. It bore the hallmarks of a psychological operation designed to linger in the enemy's mind. Whether Matilda forged it or merely exploited its existence, the scandal revealed her deepest strength, the ability to weaponize perception itself. In an age when most rulers fought with swords and siege engines, she understood that ink could be sharper than steel, and that sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones left just ambiguous enough to drive your foes mad with doubt. The true genius of the Ostiglia affair wasn't in the crafting of a fake, but in the chaos its possibility unleashed. Centuries later, forensic analysis still debates the charter's origins, while historians grapple with the larger lesson it left behind. In the hands of a strategist like Matilda, even a contested document could become a fortress, one built not of stone, but of whispers, suspicions, and the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. The marble floors of the Vatican echoed with an unusual debate in the year 1624, as scarlet-robed cardinals gathered not to discuss living saints, but a woman who'd been dead for 500 years. Matilda of Tuscany's name resurfaced with surprising urgency, championed by a faction of reformers who saw in her legacy the perfect weapon against rising Protestantism. Here, they argued, was a medieval noblewoman who defended papal supremacy with sword and treasury, a much-needed symbol for the Counter-Reformation. But beneath the polished rhetoric of sainthood petitions lurked a far thornier truth. The church that had benefited from Matilda's loyalty now hesitated to fully embrace her, caught between exploiting her legend and fearing what canonization might unleash. The push for her sainthood wasn't organic piety, it was geopolitical theater. Pope Urban VIII, facing Protestant mockery of Catholic militarism, saw in Matilda a golden opportunity, a warrior saint who could sanctify the church's temporal power. His allies circulated lurid engravings of her battles, depicting angels guiding her sword against heretics. Yet the campaign hit an unexpected snag when investigators sent to gather evidence of miracles found villagers whispering not about healings, but about the Countess' curse, old legends of imperial soldiers struck blind after looting her chapels. Even more damning were the gaps in her devotional record. Unlike typical saints, Matilda had founded no religious orders, performed no public penitence, and left no record of visions. Her piety was political, woven into treaties rather than ecstasies. The real resistance, however, came from within the Vatican's own archives. Canon lawyers dredging up her correspondence with radical theologians like Anselm found passages that raised eyebrows, questions about transubstantiation suspiciously close to Berengar's condemned heresies, coded references to the Church's unclean hands during the Investiture controversy. Most troubling, her last will's insistence that donated lands remain free of episcopal interference. a clause that smelled dangerously like proto-reformist resistance to clerical authority. In an era where Luther's ghost haunted every council, canonizing a woman who'd subtly challenged church structures was a risk Rome couldn't take. The death blow came from an unexpected quarter, the Habsburg emperors. Though Matilda had humbled their predecessor Henry IV, 17th century ambassadors invoked ancient imperial grudges, threatening to withdraw troops from the 30 Years' War if the she-wolf of Canossa was elevated. Urban, ever the pragmatist, shelved the cause, but not before ensuring her bones were rediscovered beneath St. Peter's, a consolation prize that gave her symbolic presence without official sainthood. What makes this failed campaign so revealing isn't the outcome, but the contradictions it exposed. The same church that had weaponized Matilda's military legacy now shied from her intellectual daring. The reformers who praised her defense of papal power feared the implications of a saint who'd negotiated with popes as equals. In the end, the woman too orthodox for emperors proved too unorthodox for saints, a paradox that echoes through the ages. Her unofficial cult persists in the Apennines, where farmers still leave rusted swords at roadside shrines, honoring not the sanitized icon Rome wanted, but the complex, battle-scarred protector they remember. The greatest miracle of Matilda's sainthood bid might be how thoroughly its failure preserved what mattered most: her humanity. Matilda of Tuscany's life wasn't just a story, it was a labyrinth. A woman who knelt in prayer with one hand and wielded a sword with the other, who built chapels with the same meticulous care she used to dismantle empires. Her legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of unshakable faith and ruthless strategy, piety and power intertwined so tightly that even now, centuries later, we can't pull them apart. She stood at the crossroads of medieval Europe where the spiritual and the political collided, and instead of choosing a path, she rewrote the map. Was she a saint? The church certainly thought so, elevating her as a model of devotion, a defender of the papacy who poured her wealth into sacred buildings and holy causes. Yet scratch the surface of those hagiographies, and you'll find a woman who funded radical theologians, who sparred with popes as equals, who understood canon law better than most bishops. Was her piety genuine, or just another weapon in an arsenal that included spies, forged charters, and poisoned ink? Or was she, as her enemies claimed, the ultimate schemer, a ruler who played both sides of the Investiture controversy, who humiliated emperors not for God's glory but for her own survival? Look at the gaps in the record: the missing daughter, the suspicious deaths of rivals, the empty treasury at Canossa, and it's hard not to wonder. Even her greatest act of charity, the donation of her lands to the church, reeks of calculation. She didn't just give away power, she locked it in a vault where neither kings nor heirs could touch it. But here's the truth that defies simple labels: Matilda was all these things at once. A woman who could quote scripture while planning a siege, who wept over lost children and coldly sacrificed allies, who built libraries and burned bridges with equal precision. Her genius wasn't in choosing between faith and power, but in mastering both. In an age that demanded women be either virgins or viragos, she refused the dichotomy, crafting a legacy too complex for the chroniclers to tame. So what do you think? Saint or schemer, defender of the faith or architect of her own myth? The debate isn't just academic, it's a mirror held up to how we remember power and who gets to wear a halo in history's eyes. Drop your take in the comments, and if you're hungry for more medieval mysteries that blur the lines between legend and reality, hit subscribe. The past is full of puzzles, and Matilda's is far from the last we'll unravel together.